welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kaligan, and we have a huge packed episode this week. We intentionally delayed the recording a little bit to not get cucked out of some good news regarding the Bulgarian elections, Iranian elections, some of these other things, but so much has built up in World War III over the past week that we're going to have to jam it all into this episode here for you. We've got huge things going on in France and Europe with these elections. We've got big things happening in the US with Biden potentially dropping out of the race. Julian Assange was freed from prison in the United Kingdom and has returned to Australia. We have big updates on the Russia-Ukraine front. The Dagestan terror attack happened since our previous episode. So again, a lot of things to catch up on, a lot of things to break and discuss. So I'm ready to dive right into it. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. And of course, the first news story of the week, which is a really good news story, I think, for all journalists, including myself and Conrad. Conrad, especially yourself and all those Americans who've been following the story for a little while now. Julian Assange is finally free. He has pled guilty to one charge under the Espionage Act of the United States, which is really bizarre. And his lawyers organized a deal for him that the time served in the United Kingdom prison will count as time served. And thus, he will not need to sit in prison any longer. And in fact, his private jet, which was organized by, I believe, some organizations which have sponsored his flight here, has landed in Canberra, Australia. So he is finally free. And I think eventually he'll be moving back to Queensland, which is his home state, and it's probably the most right-wing state in all of Australia. So Julian Assange, that famous journalist, is finally liberated. Just a reminder, what was Julian Assange persecuted for by the US, by the UK, and shall we say the globalists overall? Well, first and foremost, he leaked in 2011 through his website WikiLeaks, which was essentially a middleman type website, which didn't actually generate the leaks itself. It gathered them and publicized them online for everybody to view. So essentially, he wasn't the actual whistleblower, but he facilitated information from whistleblowers to be available to the public, right? Including us. Like, I've read some of his files, and well, they're pretty revelationary, especially if you take into account a lot of them had to do with the illegal torture of convicts, POWs, people captured in the Iraq-Afghanistan war, various different black sites around the US, and some of the other files. So, we talk about the Guantanamo files of 2011, where, the US detention camp in Guantanamo Bay had about 800 detainees, and a lot of them were terrorists, but these files essentially exposed some of the torture methods America was using illegally. You have other, of course, exposés. The most famous and probably most impactful expose of Julian Assange and WikiLeaks in recent years has been the 2016 Hillary Clinton emails, right? Which was tens of thousands of emails with Hillary Clinton essentially asking for the US deep states to spy on Donald Trump in his campaign. And all of that inside information was leaked to the public, which essentially, you can say, won Donald Trump the 2016 election, which was a very close election to begin with. And so he was persecuted for a long time. He sat in the Ecuadorian embassy, sort of under house arrest for a little while. The Ecuadorian embassy protected him in the UK. But eventually they, through some probably inside dealings, allowed the UK police to actually capture him, and he was imprisoned in a UK prison for almost 5 years, since 2019. So he's been sitting there until now, and recently in June of this year, he's finally been released. The plea deal has gone through. He has pled guilty to one charge under a very ancient statute in America, and he's back home in Australia. So it's really curious. And, there are some criticisms that can be thrown at Julian Assange. For example, Conrad, he never really publishes any WikiLeaks, whistleblower materials on Russia. And Russia does have many, shall we say, weird, corrupt sort of secrets going on inside, but it's almost as if he never receives that information. And he never really publishes anything that is anti-Israel, which is quite curious. People have pointed out perhaps his wife is of, say, Israeli origins, and she's maybe his handler, and she kind of, there are these accusations being thrown around. I'm not sure how true they are, but we do know Julian Assange, for the sake of journalism, he's done a lot. He's pretty much a trailblazer. He breaks the ice on a lot of these issues, and definitely no journalist should be sitting in prison for exposing the crimes of, shall we say, the hegemonic deep state of America. Because I think that is one of the most demonic things taking place right now, is this illegal torture. And if we can really imagine in an eschatological type fashion, some of these torture techniques which are being illegally used by these black sites, by the US military, will eventually be used on Orthodox Christians under the reign of the Antichrist during the end times. So to us, it's not very savory to have these things happen in the darkness somewhere through our taxpayer dollars. So again, Julian Assange, a great man, and he's been exposing it for years now.
It was really surprising news, frankly. There hadn't been a huge buildup to it or anything. Obviously, we had heard that it was working its way through, the U.S. court system. He was able to fly to Saipan, which is one of the largest island of the Northern Mariana Islands, which is, I believe, occupied by the United States. Then he was able to fly home to Australia. But the fact that this happened, just like that, is pretty big. Many people are outraged that he had to plead guilty at all. Or people are pointing out that, the Washington Post, New York Times, they retain classified documents with sensitive information literally every day. So it's clearly just political retribution. Obviously, Snowden in Russia. Russia always kind of comes up in these conversations because they inevitably, like you mentioned, Dimitri, kind of end up benefiting from these leaks. You mentioned that not only has none of the WikiLeaks really said much about Israel, but Israel has even said in the past, I think Netanyahu, that the WikiLeaks have really benefited Israel. Not really sure what the meaning was there, but regardless, it's really good to see this. Obviously, the fact that the Ecuadorian embassy gave up Assange to the UK was bad. He probably should have just sought refuge in the Russian embassy or gone to Russia like Snowden, but he was trying to play a different game, I guess. But regardless, it's great to see that he is free so that we no longer have to, like, the Free Assange campaign. Everybody can, move on to, other activism in the vein of the things that have been, revealed by the WikiLeaks themselves now that Assange personally has been freed. But unless you have anything else to really say about the Assange situation, Dimitri, it ties right into the situation in the US. Obviously, you mentioned Trump, who literally probably would not have gotten elected if it wasn't for WikiLeaks and the emails and everything, yet he was not able to pardon Assange during his term. Biden also no pardon. This is a guilty plea, which I guess he could say that it's null and void as the president. I don't know if he would do that in some kind of. It seems that he's more compromised by intelligence at this point because it might be a popular move as he currently sinks. But that leads us into the discussion after this horrible debate performance. I'm sure everybody doesn't need us to tell you about it. Biden, showed that he is really cognitively incapable of speaking for extended periods of time, let alone engaging in debates. Even CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, people are calling on him to step down as the candidate. There's rumors that, Obama, Gavin Newsom are standing by him, but that behind the scenes, they've also told him that it's time to hang up the hat. The problem is, I believe Wisconsin specifically is already locked in on candidates. Like, they couldn't have their nominee be on the ballot in some of these really important states if they nominate somebody else. I think Wisconsin's the only super important one. I think Nevada may have also come and gone. But if they're going to put someone up, it's got to be in the next few days, because if not, they're going to be stuck with Biden, which it's really 50-50 to me at this point if I had to make a prediction. Regardless, Trump is likely to win. I've been saying he was going to win before this sort of big event has occurred, but this is part of why they did the event so early in the election cycle this year, because they want people to be able to forget about this, and maybe they have some big scandals cooked up. Maybe they're going to put Trump in jail for a period of time before November. There's all sorts of things that could happen, but Dimitri, pivoting from Assange to this, what do you think is going to happen regarding the, I guess the Biden collapse, both in the polls and now just sort of in the, even behind the scenes within the Democrat machine?
Well, I think, they did give Biden a chance. They sent him to Camp David. They drugged him up. They had him trained for a week or two, very intensely. They had him memorize lines, memorize answers that he could present before Donald Trump. And they knew all the tricks that Donald Trump was going to pull. They had basically his whole game down. And Donald Trump played it very cool, calm, and collected. He didn't make any outrageous statements. I think Donald Trump's camp prepared Trump himself by basically telling him to just run to, they prepared him very well for all the very sensitive questions. Notice the questions regarding Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, potentially January 6th. Trump answered very politically correctly. There are no, say, weird sound bites from Donald Trump. I think he played very neutral, and Trump won by simply not making it into the headlines. What did make it into the headlines was Joseph Biden collapsed, like his mental, as you said, his mental situation really coming out. People are seeing that perhaps his Asperger's, his dementia is developing and moving forward. None of these modern narcotics that they're pumping him up with are doing any good. Eventually, he will need to be replaced, and I think that's where we're moving it. That's where potentially they're moving it towards. But as you said, the time is running out. Now that we're in July, we're almost 4 months, directly 4 months out of the election, and perhaps the deep state will actually run with Biden for the Democrats, and for the only reason that they will essentially stress Trump out with all these various debates and some of the other issues Trump has going on, including the various allegedly, misdemeanor charges, which they turned into felonies, which was brought up in the debate where Biden directly called Trump a felon. They will use this to stress Trump out, keep him on a short leash and a very tight leash in order for Trump's second term to be kept under control. They will have Trump elected, but only if he supports countries such as Israel, only if he supports the agenda at home, including potentially bringing in so-called legal migrants, but maybe they'll strengthen his position on, say, the Mexican issue. Now that Mexico has a Jewish president, perhaps they will allow him to deal with the illegal immigration issue and to restrict him in other areas of US policy. So I think perhaps, as we've spoken about off stream, Conrad, I think they will have Trump coming out on top instead of, say, putting all their money, and by them I mean the deep state, will essentially not be allocating enough of its resources into the Democrat camp. They won't be running Newsom, I think, for too much longer. I think he'll be pulling out very soon. And RFK, really nothing to say here. He has come out as a vaccine critic, but again, his pro-Israeli stance really doesn't give me any hope that he will come out guns blazing and sort of win off of this in the long term. He does, of course, have very promising. He has certain points which are very promising, like he's a big health advocate, things like that. But his Zionist positions, I think, make him very unsavory. And of course, Zionism being one of the hot topics was like a big talking point in this debate because both sides have, again, agreed on the "we must support Israel" issue. And Joe Biden himself, I think, attempted to, meet Trump on this particular moment. And again, Trump, he does come out as the more pro-Israel candidate here. And I think if AIPAC gets behind Trump, there won't be anything Joe Biden can do, especially since Joe Biden has, not demanded things of Netanyahu recently, but he has softened his support for Israel, which the Jewish lobby in America has come out in criticism of Joe Biden. So I think that's going to play a really large role moving forward in the election. It's not to be ignored. And I even heard very moderate Russian political commentators, actually, when they were looking at the US debate recently, they've even said that the Israeli Jewish lobby will play a very large factor in this election. Notice Russia wasn't brought up. The Russia hoax hasn't really been a talking point, which is, I think, really important that finally, perhaps, Israel, the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, will have the spotlight rather than any of these red herrings which were brought up in the previous few election cycles, which of course distract a lot of people. Because now, as we can see on social media, people are waking up, and suddenly, if Donald Trump makes any sort of very pro-Zionist statements, maybe folks will start, asking questions. Like Nick Fuentes is back on Twitter. We can clearly point the spotlight at some of Trump's larger holes in his policies, including his international policy in supporting Israel unequivocally.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, you spoke about the Israel-Muslim kind of issue there. Michigan is key to both sides' victory here, Biden and Trump. And we remember Biden had a huge number of basically Democrat votes that voted just for anybody not Biden. Basically, it was a not decided or whatever the vote was. So just by vote suppression and, lack of turnout on the Democrat side from the Muslim cohort in Michigan, which has one of the largest Muslim diasporas in the world outside of, the Muslim world. That alone could push Trump over the line. So if Trump was smart, he's not going to push that issue too much. But then he runs up against the fact that if he gets $100 million from Miriam Adelson, she's going to want to hear about West Bank annexation, supporting Israel, supporting them in a war in Lebanon, supporting them against Iran, going to war with Iran, targeting Iran's nuclear capabilities, fulfilling prophecies from the saints on the wrong side, of the issue, unfortunately. And that's something we're going to have to deal with. We're talking about annexation of the West Bank, of course. There's been some rumors and news of basically the Palestinian Authority being overthrown by the Israelis, which we have yet to see fully confirmed by on-the-ground sources, but again, rumors. And this week, we're actually going to have an Ether Hour with a good friend of ours, Isaac, Palestinian fellow, who many of you may be aware of on Twitter or on Substack, and he tells us all about the situation in the West Bank and the potential war in Lebanon and sort of the demographics and factions there behind the whole Palestinian struggle and their current war basically against Israel and the Zionists. So look forward to that. Get behind the paywall, worldwarnow.co, everything, linked. Be sure to get behind the paywall to hear that fantastic episode upcoming, probably going to be released Wednesday. But with all of that, Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say about the Trump-Biden race, obviously we're going to be watching the next debates if they even happen, and be sure to follow us on the socials. We will be speculating on things like Trump's running mate, potential replacements if Biden really goes down. The only way that some of these states could have a different candidate on the ballot is if Biden dies. So, maybe they'll just stop, giving him his medicine. I don't really know what the plan is for the Democrats here. They're really in a tight bind. But unless you have anything else to say on the current decline of quote unquote democracy in my country here, Dimitri, perhaps it's time to go to a much more tragic event that we missed last week. It happened right after we recorded. It's this terror attack in Dagestan, which created some new martyrs in the Orthodox Church.
That's right. Yes. So on essentially the double feast day of Pentecost and the celebration of the Holy and Life-Giving Trinity, two terrorist attacks actually took place as well. So it's a double feast day and a double terrorist attack, both essentially taking place hours apart from one another. Firstly, in Sevastopol, you had the bombardment of the Russian beach, just near a church. Actually, people were on the beach essentially, and a Ukrainian ground-to-ground long-range artillery missile shot cluster munitions all over a beach. Allegedly they were aiming for one of the Russian airports, but as they ended up hitting essentially civilian targets over there. Potentially, someone did claim on Russian news that they were perhaps aiming for the church, which people were leaving after Pentecost and actually going to the beach to spend the rest of their Sunday there. And in fact, we saw all that horrible footage of hundreds of people receiving shrapnel wounds, things like that, including a little girl who ended up dying, and some other folks who ended up passing away. A lot of people still in hospital near Sevastopol, so that's in Crimea, essentially former Ukraine, so that Russian peninsula. So that was the first huge terrorist attack, which again, there are still questions as to, did the U.S. actually, we know the U.S. provided some of these munitions to Ukraine, which of course these are these cluster munitions, which were used in this, essentially attack on a civilian target, but we don't know if U.S. long-range surveillance from some of those drones, as well as planes flying over the Black Sea, the neutral waters, actually helped aim this Ukrainian long-range artillery and aim these bombs onto, say, the Sevastopol beach. That's another question. And in fact, that could potentially escalate things into, well, let's just say red lines would have been definitely crossed here. And, Shoigu's claims that if Crimea is ever attacked, we'll retaliate, I think have essentially fallen on deaf ears at this point. And that's why Shoigu is probably not the Minister of Defense anymore, because last thing we need is empty statements, I think, especially in this conflict. And, the huge terrorist attack, which was quite a shock, I think took everybody by complete surprise. It's one thing where Ukraine bombs civilian targets or promotes terrorist acts in Novorossiya and Crimea. It's another story when we have a more or less relatively peaceful area where Muslims and Christians have coexisted for hundreds of years. Suddenly, the peace is broken by a double shooting. It's a well-coordinated terrorist act in two cities at once in the Russian Republic of Dagestan, which is located on the northern Caucasus, so essentially just north, if you follow the Caspian Sea coast, just north of Azerbaijan, just across the mountain range there. You have the city of Derbent and the city of Makhachkala. Makhachkala being the capital of Dagestan, around 600,000 people, quite a large urban population there. Not that many sky-rise, high-class buildings there. It's a bit less crowded than, say, Grozny, for example, in Chechnya, but Makhachkala being the capital, and just south of that, the city of Derbent, about 150,000 people there. Both of these cities have, relatively small Orthodox Christian communities. Derbent, in particular, has only about 20 Orthodox Christian churches, and Makhachkala about the same. And you had essentially these Islamic Wahhabi extremists coordinate two attacks in the same places at once. You had two terrorists in Makhachkala strike an Orthodox Christian church. Fortunately enough, there was a guard who was defending the parish. This is during the service. So the liturgy, I think, has just completed. People were leaving the church, and the guard in the Makhachkala church had a pistol on him. This is an Orthodox Christian guard named Michael Vavilov. Now, Michael Vavilov was noticed that Orthodox Christian churches require guards armed with pistols in some of these regions, which I think explains exactly how dangerous they are. And Michael Vavilov confronted the two Wahhabi terrorists who were armed with AR-15s. They had scopes on them, and he ended up confronting them in a shootout. He was killed, wounded several times, but he held the terrorists off and closed the gates of the church yard, as well as warned the priest, and the priest ran into the church, gathered all the parishioners, locked the church up, and the two killers were deterred by the fact that the church was defended by one guard, and perhaps they feared that this one guard with a little gas pistol, a small caliber pistol, he could have had some support, so they killed him, ran away next door. Next door, and there was actually in Makhachkala there was a synagogue. So the synagogue was empty. The Jews weren't celebrating anything that Sunday, and so they just wrote some quotes out of the out of a certain surah, out of the Quran on the walls, with like graffiti spray paint, and then they entered into a shootout with the local police. Now, the Derbent police and the Makhachkala police did not have any Kevlar on, so this is where a lot of the losses actually came from. 15 Dagestani Russian police officers were killed, including, some of them were Orthodox and some were Muslim, including the chief of police of Derbent. And this is in both of these conflicts, and it's just really sad because you never have this many police officers actually die. A lot more than the Crocus City Hall accident, where most of the casualties were all civilians inside of the actual hall itself. But here we have police officers just getting killed outright because they're just not armed. They have pistols, whatnot. But yeah, eventually Russian SWAT showed up and counter-terrorist forces, and they ended up killing these two perpetrators in Makhachkala. And the graffiti on the synagogue, of course, the local Jews, who are a super small minority, they started crying. They said it was anti-Jewish hate crime. Meanwhile, there was literally an Orthodox guard killed next door. It was clearly their first target was the church, not the synagogue. The synagogue was extra. But the guard, Michael Vavilov, is now locally venerated. He had a really, shall we say, very pious funeral where all the Orthodox Christians of the city gathered, and even Muslims went into the church and gathered outside because they understood how special this was to have somebody die for the faith, defending his neighbors. It's just a very special moment for Orthodox Christians. On one hand, it's a tragedy having an Orthodox Christian man, a guard who's dedicated 10 years. He's been a parishioner in this church, who served in the altar, who served as the guard of the church, and his life was taken in this sort of tragedy. So I think locally he'll be venerated as a martyr. And in the city of Derbent, an even more tragic story, you can say, the local priest, whose house is located right next to the church, after the liturgy, he went next door into his really sort of small home, and three killers this time entered into the home itself. They slit his throat and they shot him. He ended up bleeding out, dying right there and then. They killed Father Nicholas Kotelnikov, who, save him in your prayers as well. He's now, I believe, at least a local bishop. Bishop Varlam of Makhachkala and Grozny has considered him a martyr, so he's locally venerated. So Father Nicholas was slain. And then, of course, the Derbent police began arriving. And again, same issue. The police were not armed with Kevlars and didn't have the adequate firepower. And this time the three killers in this city began shooting at them. I think some civilians ended up dying, but most of the losses came from the police officers. And eventually, of course, the killers were all slain. And what's interesting, Conrad, is when they did take the killers' mobile phones, because they were interested, well, what did these guys have? Like, they found Telegram chats where these 5 killers were discussing murdering this priest ahead of time. There was some screenshots circulating online where they were claiming to, they were saying all kinds of the bizarre Muslim extremist quotes that you usually see in these chat rooms, except there was a 6th secret person inside that chat room, and there were only 5 killers between these two cities. And so it's curious as to who the 6th person is. Is he some sort of, they were saying Mossad or CIA handler? Notice all the bishops. So Archbishop Sabo of Zelenograd, Bishop Pitirim Tvorgov of Skopinsk, Archbishop Theophylact, and of course Archbishop Varlam, whose diocese this terrorist act took place in. Most of the archbishops around the area, actually, of the Orthodox Church, when discussing this tragedy, they all point fingers not at, say, the local Muslim population, who they know very well, and the local Muslim population is very moderate, shall we say. They're claiming that international some special forces, agitators, perhaps spies from either the CIA or other organizations, essentially agitated these people to cause these terrorist attacks. And the other really questionable thing is, I think, in this particular terror act, right, these 5 killers, one of them was actually a member of the local political party, which was like a center right-wing party called Spravedlivaya Rossiya, Just Russia, and being run by Sergei Mironov. And the other 2 killers, I think the 2 in Derbent, were actually the children of a local United Russia mayor, Mohammed Amarov. And they came from the Amarov family, which is a local oligarch-run United Russia family. And Amarov had 8 sons. 2 of them ended up joining this Wahhabi extremist clan. But in the early 2000s, there was actually an article released in the Dagestan local newspaper calling these 2 young, sort of Muslims party boys, and calling them corrupt members of the Dagestani Golden Youth, which is like Zolotaya Молодежь. I guess you could refer it to as like a local mafia in a way. So these 2 guys were not Wahhabists in their youth, but somehow something caused them to turn into extremists. It's a really curious situation. But United Russia removed the Amarov mayor from their website, so Amarov was completely removed from there, and they have renounced him. So again, local corruption mixed in with potentially foreign agitation has allegedly led to this terrorist act taking place. It's unlike Crocus, which had essentially illegal immigrants causing the terrorist acts, allegedly, being trained by Ukraine. Here we have essentially local boys, as they claimed. These guys are quite young. One of them was like some local MMA fighter, which again is a little bit questionable as to why MMA fighters are turning into Wahhabists and Islamic extremists. I think at the end of the day, it's a multifaceted issue, Conrad, and it doesn't really touch on the issue of immigration too much, but it does bring into question some of the local corruption taking place in these Muslim regions, such as Chechnya and Dagestan, which have a lot of taxpayer-related benefits which the central Russian government is giving them, right? We saw Putin visit Derbent earlier last year, if you recall. Remember him holding one of the oldest Qurans in the Caucasus, claiming that this is a holy book for all these people. These regions of Russia, unfortunately, are receiving a lot of media attention for no reason whatsoever, and it doesn't seem to really deal with some of the Islamic extremism which keeps rising up in them. Why? I mean, look, we have to ask the big question as to why do the guards even require pistols at these parishes? Like your parish in the US, Conrad, I'm sure there are people who are armed, Conrad, but you don't necessarily need a compulsory guard at the church the entire time. But it does lead to questions as to why these regions are so dangerous for Christians. And, hopefully the bishops will begin asking these questions and maybe the right message will spread.
Now, you mentioned the MMA fighters. It's super interesting, the fact that Russian authorities are literally raiding the gym of, MMA champion Khabib Nurmagomedov, however you say his freaking Dagestani last name. But he is, somehow connected with these guys that were obviously, like you said, training at his gym. What's the weird Muslim connection? You see this kind of stuff with people like Sneeko and these people that are kind of adjacent to this alt media, sports, Joe Rogan, UFC world. It seems that they're generally kind of against religion, but the religion they seem to be more gravitating towards is Islam. That's not to say that there aren't Christian fighters, but we remember that one guy right after the Russia-Ukraine war started that was super mad that his nationality on the title card said Russia instead of Dagestan, but Dagestan isn't a country, right? So, but the issue, like you said, is that the people immediately jumping towards this as a CIA operation. The evidence isn't quite there. Obviously, I'm sure that intelligence are hoping to agitate the Muslim population of Russia against the SMO, against Russian unity, against the Federation. But ultimately, in Chechnya, that's probably why this is all going on in Dagestan and Ingushetia, because it seems that Kadyrov and the power that his clan exerts in Chechnya are able to keep some of these things more in check. But Dagestan and these other places are a bit more vulnerable. Obviously, the Russians need to watch all of their borders, all of their peripheral areas, all of their minority groups for infiltration. We know about the Tajik problem with the Crocus City Hall stuff, and we're going to talk about later in the show this upcoming huge Maginot Line type project on the border with Russia and the Baltic states and Belarus and Königsberg, Kaliningrad, and all these things. So Russia needs to be careful on its borders, because even if they somehow win and settle this thing in Ukraine, this is certainly only the beginning of, again, it's World War III. This thing is not just the Russia-Ukraine war anymore by any stretch of the imagination. But we probably have to start talking about these other elections going on, Dmitry. Unless you have anything else to say about Dagestan, it's probably good to talk about what's going on in Iran.
No, I think Iran is actually very much a smooth transition point here, Conrad, because as we know, Makhachkala, which sounds like a bit of a monkey's breakfast, used to be called Petrov Port, which Peter the Great founded as one of the main trading hubs to actually trade between the Russian Empire, which he founded or, transformed the Tsardom of Russia into its empire, to trade with the Persian Empire and, the Shah of Persia just south in the Caspian. So Dagestan does tie very nicely into what's happening in that southern region of Iran at the moment now during the elections.
Yeah, it's really important. Obviously, we can't say that there's a winner yet because it's multiple rounds. I believe the second round is going to be decided sometime mid-July, the next 2 weeks or something like that. This is being recorded 1st of July. But the two candidates that got by far the vast majority of the votes in the aftermath of, if everyone remembers, of course, Ibrahim Raisi, the president of Iran, died in that helicopter crash. Still a lot of mystery around the circumstances there. Not a lot of evidence seems to have emerged that it was necessarily an assassination, but I still think that's something that needs to be heavily considered when we're looking back on this as a historical event. But regardless, the two big candidates that both received basically the same amount of votes, around 2.5 million each, with a third candidate getting about 780,000. Those candidates being I believe the one who got the most votes was Masoud Pezeshkian, who is the more reformist candidate. He's a doctor. He is not as much of, as they call them, hardliners that are in line with the mullahs, with the Ayatollah, who want to continue the spirit of the Islamic Revolution, as they say. And then the very close runner-up, the other major candidate, Saeed Jalili, is, as you would say, a hardliner. He is a nuclear negotiator who is, kind of at the front of pushing Iran's nuclear capabilities forward, making sure that Iran is standing strong on the world stage as an independent pole, forging relations with the Russians and these sorts of things. Obviously, he is the more Raisi-esque candidate. And then the third place candidate, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, he got, like I said, 780,000 votes or so. His party is the Progress and Justice Population of Islamic Iran, which, again, it's hard to decipher these political party names, but it's understood that most of his votes will ultimately go in the second round now that he's been eliminated to Jalili, because his party is also a Islamic revolutionary, principalist hardliner party. So Jalili seems to be the likely candidate for the next president of Iran, which will continue the legacy of Raisi, which seems only fair as he was, robbed of the rest of his term by this helicopter crash situation. So I think it would probably be the best for the Iranians if Jalili won. I don't know if there's going to be any color revolution, soft power pressure from the intelligent state to get Pezeshkian in there. We were talking off air, he is in favor of minorities across the country, having their language integrated into the school system, some of these other things. I don't know exactly what other, perhaps more secularist positions he may hold. I'm sure he's in favor of scaling down the morality police, which has kind of already happened. Some of these other things that always are popular among both the minorities as well as just those that are more secular and less in favor of the Islamization of Iranian society. But we have some other big elections we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the French elections and the Bulgarian patriarchal elections, both of which are white pills, specifically the Bulgarian patriarchal elections. But before we discuss those, Dimitri, I'd love your thoughts on these Iranian results real quick.
Yeah, of course, it's comforting to see Saeed Jalili actually coming out ahead here. Having a few more 100,000 votes than of course the doctor who has a very Armenian last name, and we haven't seen a lot of good stuff come out of Armenia recently. So Pezeshkian, it does sound like somewhat Armenian influence there. Perhaps maybe some of his ancestors were from that part of the world. Unfortunately, Armenian politics is very liberal inspired these days, and so Dr. Pezeshkian running for the elections, very curious. I would wonder what his opinions on COVID were during the breakout in Iran. I think that would probably, I bet some of his statements during that pandemic in Iran, especially since it was, a lot of people allegedly died or they had issues with treatment, things like that. Perhaps they even had some questionable uses of various vaccines or experimental vaccines in those particular areas. Those probably would play into his role in this coming election, because notice him being the more liberal candidate, he's being pushed by the West. Most Western news sources, including The Guardian, for example, and most mainstream media sources, if you do read about Dr. Pezeshkian, they are claiming that compared to Jalili, he's almost like the pro-woman candidate too. They're like, okay, he's pro-woman, he's pro-freedom. And Iran, mind you, if you look at it on the map, right next to its neighbor, Afghanistan, like the difference in the way women are treated in these two Islamic countries is night and day. Afghanistan has some practices relating to, the treatment of women. And mind you, if you really want to hear about more like feminism, things like that, we do have our 8th-hour episode, which has just dropped recently. I mean, that's a really good sort of take on that particular ideology. But Iran has always been very pro-woman to begin with. So these recent uprisings of the feminists in Iran are really ill-placed, because Afghanistan next door, that's where real, shall we say, female abuse occurs. Even from an Islamic perspective, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, that really doesn't even compare to what's taking place in Afghanistan. So I think this whole pro-woman agenda thing is really a Western psyop in many ways. Iran is very much, if anything, it's probably more feminist than most Orthodox countries, I would say. But Jalili naturally coming out on top, I think it's a good thing because naturally he will keep pushing former President Raisi's. He was a big Raisi ally, so and Raisi has set the tone for this pro-BRICS, pro-multipolar vision of Iran going into the future of foreign policy around the world. And again, Raisi was very much anti-Israel, anti-globalist, and in many ways pro-Russia as well, helping Russia obtain a lot of those Shahed drones and never really standing in the way of, shall we say, Iran being an in-between empire, like a rising Middle Eastern power between China and Russia, really not opposing either of the big sides, but also kind of working together and forming this triangle, this new axis of power. In Asia, on the Asian continent, I think it's a really strong position to have. And Jalili being involved in the Iran-Iraq war in the past, being a veteran, I think it also plays into his appreciation of war. Unlike this doctor who has probably gone to war in a different sort of theater, more like going into surgeries, things like that, he perhaps doesn't understand exactly what happens in the field of conflict. And essentially, as we see the Middle East devolve and break itself down, I think the next president of Iran needs to be a person who will really understand what warfare is and what the shall we say, Muslims, the Sunnis and the Shias are facing in Syria and Palestine under the oppression of Israel, and especially Lebanon, moving into that particular area. I think you need somebody who has a strong position like Jalili, and hopefully he does end up winning this Iranian election. I think for everybody's really hoping that we don't have a reformist president in Iran, especially moving into this stage of a hot World War III. The last thing we need is Iran, which is standing on a shaky footing, right? That would be disastrous for the region.
As we discussed with the U.S. election, unfortunately, if Trump comes into power, there's probably going to be harsher sanctions put on Iran as the pro-Israel signaling ramps up. Ultimately, there would also be a lessening of sanctions on Russia, so you give and you take, right? So hopefully the Russians could help the Iranians out in their future time of need, as the Iranians have helped them out with, drone technology and other, much less highly taxed goods that they were able to import from Iran as they struggled with sanctions and these other shocks that the Western powers tried to apply to their economy. But these other elections that we have to talk about, the French election, I want to talk about the results of the first round, big loss for Macron. These are the exit polls and the number of seats. It's predicted that the National Rally Coalition, Le Pen's party, she's pledged to have Bardella, the young nationalist, to be the prime minister if they are to take power in the parliament. They have won 240 270 seats as predicted right now by the exit polls. The New Popular Front, which is the left-wing, far-left coalition, they are predicted to get 180 to 200 seats. Macron's Ensemble, which are the pro-EU centrist liberals, they're projected to get 60 to 90 seats. And then the French Republican Party, who are like moderate conservatives, they're going to get 30 to 50 seats. And immediately after these results were announced, left-wing people went to the streets. They're protesting. They're calling for violence against National Rally voters, like putting up signs saying that if you voted for the far right, we're going to get you, all of these things. And then we see Xavier Iacovelli, who's a senator for the Renaissance Party, which is the ruling Macron coalition party. He proposed a Democratic-Republican United Front with the popular far-left front to stop Le Pen's National Rally from winning the French legislative elections. Now, if they did that and truly united, that might be enough to do it. But if the Republicans, like the moderate conservative party with their, 30 to 40 seats or so, if they then with Le Pen, they might be able to push them over the boundary as well. So it's going to be very tight there. We're going to see what happens in the second round. We'll see if the nationalists and Le Pen can pull it out. Obviously, I'm not as energized about Le Pen, kind of similar to the Trump situation, because she disavowed the AfD. She kicked them out of the Identity and Democracy group in the European Parliament. She is backtracking on all these issues. Her speech about her victory included denouncing anti-Semitism, calling the far left in France, growing anti-Semitism, all this stuff, obviously, because they're more Islamist, obviously have more of an Islamic voter base. It kind of makes sense that you would be signaling against the Muslims, but ultimately it is kind of unfortunate to see her just drifting right to the center, just like Maloney, just like, of course, Geert Wilders, who, frankly, that guy was always such a philo-Semite that I never had that he was going to actually do anything good. The Sweden Democrats were never that based. But at this point, we have Orban, who, ultimately is siding with the AfD and is doing a lot of good things, but we know that in the back pocket, he still is sort of a an Israeli-Likud connection. I'm really hopeful for the AfD. I'm hoping as they slowly but surely climb to the top of German politics that they're going to be able to truly redefine what it means to be right-wing in Europe. We see the same in Austria with the Freedom Party and a few of these other places. But Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say about France or any of these other European elections, we do have some great news out of Bulgaria.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think, and you know what ties Bulgaria and some of these other European countries, and especially the right wing winning in a lot of these states, is not even their relationship to Israel, which is quite unfortunate. You know, as you just mentioned, it's quite bad, I think, from our perspective. But what is their attitude towards NATO and this growing European American run, essentially? It's run from Washington, D.C. America funds the majority of NATO. What is their opinion on Europe being essentially the call boy, the secretary of the United States, and basically obeying U.S. foreign policy in everything, essentially everything that takes place, and most of what takes place in the Mediterranean is essentially according to the whims of Israel too. So that whole Zionist agenda is tied directly into NATO goals of keeping Israel safe and keeping Russia at bay as well, which is really I would say, anti-European at this point. So Bulgaria is tied into this nicely because the election there, Bulgaria is a very Orthodox Christian country, right? The liberation of Bulgaria, which took place in the 1870s and even prior to that, and especially solidified under the Russian liberation of Bulgaria in 1878 and basically the special military operation of Emperor Alexander II when he liberated Bulgaria from the Ottoman Empire, from the Islamic Caliphate, and Bulgaria was given its freedom, which now it's almost going to celebrate 150 years of its freedom in 2028 from the Ottoman yoke. This Reconquista, which took place, was very much led by the Orthodox Christian Church. And so potentially, we're looking at the Bulgarian Patriarch and this particular election, this new Patriarch, which was now elected this weekend, which is a huge victory, I think, for conservative Orthodox Christians. And we're hoping that potentially this new leader of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church, and Bulgaria is not a giant country, mind you, it's smaller than Belarus, right? So we had a recent 8th-hour episode discussing Belarus and its domestic policies. Bulgaria is much smaller. It's slightly bigger than Serbia, but still, the Orthodox Church in Bulgaria will essentially lead the country potentially in the future out of this yoke of NATO, of the shall we say, Judeo false Christian order, which controls it today in terms of foreign and domestic policy. Bulgaria does have military bases of NATO on its soil, unlike Romania, which has much larger bases next door. But perhaps this new Patriarch Daniel, who was recently elected, will lead the way towards perhaps a pro-Orthodox liberation in the coming years.
No, that's very true. I believe his election is a fulfillment of Saint Porphyrios' prophecy of, the new crew coming to man the ship. He's a young man. He's 52 years old, was born in 1972. And I'll just read kind of how the election went down. Unfortunately, while we're joyful that he won, it was unfortunately close. I was hoping that the pro-NATO doxy, pro-schismatic guy would be, soundly defeated. But here's basically what happened in the first round of voting. 64 votes went to Gregory of Rasa, who was the pro-schismatic candidate. 51 votes went to Metropolitan Daniel of Eden, who went on to win. And then 19 votes were cast for Gabriel of Lovec, who I guess was another bishop who was in favor of the canonical church and, not falling into this ecumenical patriarch schismatic nonsense. And then so he was eliminated. And then in the second round, 69 votes went for Metropolitan Daniel and 66 votes went for Gregory of Ratza. So, thankfully, to thank those who voted for Metropolitan Gabriel realized what they needed to do, united behind Metropolitan Daniel, and now we have a very holy and prayerful patriarch. One of the priests at my parish actually was tonsured a reader back in 2012 in the Bulgarian church in America by Metropolitan Daniel. He was the abbot at a Bulgarian monastery in western Massachusetts for a few years before he was called back to Bulgaria. So there's a strong American connection. He's a lover of Father Seraphim Rose. He was present at the 30th anniversary of his repose to celebrate with Metropolitan Hilarion and other Orthodox figures from across America. So this is quite wonderful. His immediate statement after being enthroned was about how grateful and lucky Bulgaria is to be an Orthodox nation and how it needs to protect its orthodoxy and not be interested in, falling for other foreign, faiths or religions. And there were many political figures and even other religious figures and priests and bishops within Bulgaria warning about this patriarchal election being infiltrated and the West trying to use their influence. And ultimately, I believe that was to get Metropolitan Gregory of Ratza elected, but that was ultimately defeated, and we see Orthodoxy triumphing in Bulgaria, which is a wonderful thing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. This news, of course, strengthening of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and of course, this probably really highlights that the position on Ukraine very much is the defining one, right? Because you're either in support of this Mike Pompeo-ish, CIA-ish subversion of the Orthodox Church, or you're with the truth. And the truth is not necessarily pro-Russian; it's just simply the truth, the belief in the Orthodox faith as it was passed down to us, without any weird subversive add-ons, which you do see very often. And I think Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, residing in Istanbul, I think was not very happy about this victory, because I don't know what kind of leverage he has over Bulgaria and what kind of leverage his, Istanbul pro-left-wing lobby, what his Greek hierarchs have lined up against Bulgaria in and of itself. We do know he does collect certain points from various jurisdictions around him as to what he can use in order to score with them and perhaps push this pro-Ukrainian schismatic line. But Bulgaria, it seems that has now achieved its independence, ecclesiastically speaking. Like jurisdictionally, we covered this in our St. John Vatatsis Afer episode. Bulgaria received autocephaly several times throughout its history, and once under St. John Vatatsis, actually, the Byzantine Roman Emperor there. So very curious how all of this ties together very nicely. Bulgaria is one of those countries which inherits that history of the Byzantine Romans, and I think it carries it forward. Naturally, it's had plenty of challenges over the last few hundred years, and this Judeo-NATO yoke on which it's under at the moment, in a worldly sense, I think is no different, right? And moving forward, I think this young hierarchy could be the patriarch of Bulgaria for literally a generation, 25, 30 years. You look at Patriarch Ilya in Georgia, and Georgia is flourishing under Patriarch Ilya right now. You can see they're passing anti-LGBTQ bills. They had the foreign agent bill passed recently. There's great progress being made under, you have a stable sort of situation in the church, and it reflects on the nation itself, because, and a prayerful man, like he looks like his physiognomy is that of an elder, which you can imagine sitting at an ecumenical council or emerging out of the grounds of some really well-esteemed monastery. I mean, and if you can even judge somebody by the way that he looks, I think this is really worthy patriarch, and we have heard very good things about him. So that's very promising. And so moving forward, I think the relationship between Bulgaria and Russia will be also strengthened, and this new shall we say, Western anti-LGBTQ bloc in Eastern Europe will be strengthened as well, generally speaking. Naturally, the church, the biggest cathedral they have in Bulgaria at the moment, is the St. Alexander Nevsky Cathedral in Sofia. And, that cathedral actually being built in honor of Emperor Alexander II, Saint Alexander Nevsky, that Russian prince who at one time ruled in Novgorod and protected Rus from both the Mongols as well as the Germanic Teutonic Knights and the Estonian pagans at one point. It does show that Bulgarian ties, their ties to Russia are very strong, and they kind of remain united in that capacity. So, it's just amazing news, especially in a time when you literally hear about church persecution everywhere, in Palestine, in Ukraine, around the world, in Moldova even, and suddenly you have this giant victory. It shows you that the Holy Spirit is very much active in the world, and we are given these small bits of peace and glory every now and then, which help strengthen us. And of course, probably the other really big piece of news we have from Russia in and of itself is that really by surprise, this caught us completely by surprise. It was footage that came out of Minsk in Lukashenko's Belarus, which, we covered Lukashenko's Belarus on the 8th Hour episode recently, how Belarus does not persecute Orthodox Christianity, so it's a safe haven. We saw footage of the main cathedral in Minsk, the Russian Exarch, serving alongside a surprise bishop, Metropolitan Jonathan of Tulchin. And we're like, hold on, wasn't he just sitting in a Ukrainian prison? And it's true. He was suddenly released. There was some sort of exchange which took place behind the scenes. Patriarch Kirill actually revealed it, came out and said that he struck a certain deal with the Ukrainian law enforcement, perhaps certain. We actually don't know what the deal was about. But, allegedly someone in the Roman Catholic circle said that Patriarch Kirill gave Pope Francis a call, and Pope Francis pulled a few strings with Zelensky. I'm kind of doubtful of that. I don't think Pope Francis was involved in this deal at all. I don't think he has any influence over Zelensky and the Jewish lobby of Dnipropetrovsk. But Patriarch Kirill managed to get one of his most loyal and one of the most loyal Orthodox Christian bishops in Ukraine out of prison, and he's been in prison for almost 2 years now. And Metropolitan Jonathan served during the feast day of Pentecost in Minsk, and then he arrived in Moscow. He was awarded the Medal of St. Sergius of Radonezh by Patriarch Kirill for his bravery during his confessorship, basically spending almost 2 years in Ukrainian prison for essentially nothing, for posting online about how the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is essentially a daughter church of the Russian Orthodox Church, and they need to remain united. And he was fighting against the schism for years now. He was one of the first bishops. It's interesting. You look at the history of all these bishops who are being persecuted, like Metropolitan Longin of Banshen, Metropolitan Jonathan of Tulchin, even Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye. They all have various achievements which are very different. Metropolitan Longin, he's always been fighting against heresy, ecumenism, even criticizing Patriarch Kirill himself at one point for that Havana agreement in 2016, where Patriarch Kirill and Pope Francis had like a bit of a hangout in Cuba. You have Metropolitan Jonathan of Tulchin, who is very loyal to the Russian Church and actually has been fighting against internal schism against the false patriarch Filaret of Kiev, been fighting against Epiphany very openly. And by fighting, I mean, on paper, calling them out for some of their schismatic, heretical actions over the years. And he was one of the first bishops to be imprisoned by the Ukrainian regime. And he's remained like a steadfast follower of the Ukrainian elders and saints of recent years. I think, when we speak about Elder Zosima of Donbass, Elder Jonah of Odessa, Metropolitan Jonathan is sort of towing that line, which is the Orthodox Christian line in my view. And so it's really great to see him now that he can finally have some medical treatment. He did have a stroke in Ukrainian prison, so you could even hear in the sermon which he gave with Patriarch Kirill, his speech was a little bit slurred. It was a bit slower than, say, you would expect normally, and it's definitely, he has suffered psychological damage while being in prison. It's just really sad. So hopefully now he can finally regain some of that vigor which he had before. Of course, the other really quite amazing story, Conrad, from this week was the return of the Rublev's Trinity icon back to the Trinity of Sergius Lavra, which we saw Putin actually attend. That icon being put up on the iconostasis of that Lavra near the relics of Saint Sergius. That's just a massive monastery north of Moscow, about 100 kilometers or so, which is a huge return of that icon, which is not supposed to really be standing in a museum. You had all these experts claim that, well, if this ancient icon, mind you, the icon's only about 600 years, right? We do have icons which are literally thousands of years old, right? Or roughly 1,500 years old at the monastery of Saint Catherine on Mount Sinai, which still there to this day and are not in various scientific capsules. You do have these claims by Russian experts that this icon is only 600 years old. The paint will deteriorate inside of the church. It shouldn't be venerated by people, sweaty people, people who cough on the icon. It's going to be ruined. And Patriarch Kirill, he just answers these lab coat experts by saying icons die and deteriorate inside of museums and laboratories. Icons regain life and they renew miraculously inside of churches. And it's true. You look at the icons on Mount Athos, there are no scientists applying ointments to them, renewing them, etc. Like I do know, and iconographers will probably correct me, there are treatments for icons and things like that from an artistic perspective, but icons can stand in churches without any strange, weird, sort of COVID-esque hazmat suit treatment. And that's completely fine. And they flourish in these prayerful environments, which I think this icon for its entire history has been standing near the relics of Saint Sergius of Radonezh, and I think it's been inheriting the grace from this miraculous saint. Mind you, Saint Sergius is one of the most famous saints of the Russian Church. He was one of the few Russian saints who actually resurrected at least a few people. Perhaps we know from his life he resurrected a young boy, and resurrections in the Orthodox Church are quite rare miracles. So Saint Sergius, a very prayerful saint, and it was good seeing Vladimir Putin and Patriarch Kirill venerate this icon and the relics of Saint Sergius. I mean, this was like a huge boost, and it's good to see Russian people increase their morale by viewing their president in a sort of prayerful state. I think regardless of how sincere it is, I think simply showing that to them at a time of need, which is at the moment when the whole world is viewing Russia as the enemy, as an enemy of mankind. I think it's really, I think it's a very positive event, Conrad. So lots of good things taking place in Russia at the moment.
Yeah, despite, terrorist attacks, Dagestan, these attacks in Sevastopol, these are unfortunately, I think, desperate attempts by the regime to stop the inevitable, which is the victory in Ukraine. We see Russian advances pretty much in all directions. We see them surrounding Volchansk. We see them moving forward in new directions in Kharkov. We see them moving towards Zaporozhye, working towards the city. We saw that pretty cool Russian campaign recruitment ad of these, civil workers, I guess, public works guys, yellow vest, people in their truck, switching all of the old Ukrainian signs back to the Russian names, places like Chasov Yar, Avdiivka, Marinka, these places. And then in the back of the truck, there's, Zaporozhye, Kherson. Kharkov, even some of these other signs in the back of the truck for people to eventually go and replace. So we're seeing the work happening in almost all directions. But we're seeing big news from the Belarusians as well. We see them moving all sorts of equipment to their border with Ukraine, as well as the Ukrainians moving, thousands and thousands of troops to the border, to the point where the Russians, Peskov is saying that it's a concern to the Belarusians and the Russians. The head of the Belarusian armed forces said that a total of 10 NATO battalions are surrounding Belarus from the NATO countries, 20,000 troops are basically on their borders with the Baltics and Poland. And we also heard about that 2.5 billion euro plan to basically build this Maginot Line. It mostly seems to be around Belarus. Obviously, it would be protecting the Baltics from Russia, but it would be around, Kaliningrad, Königsberg Oblast, Lithuania and Poland's big borders with Belarus, I guess, to supposedly prevent the famous Russian sweep across Europe that we know is definitely coming any day now. But Russia is working in pretty much every direction, despite the basic terror attacks now being used by American artillery, both on places like Belgorod and Bryansk, as well as Sevastopol, as was mentioned. The allowance of these long-range weapons to be used in Russia is evidence that the current regime, at least, whether it's Biden, Blinken, whoever you want to blame it on being in power, CIA, maybe it's some UK intelligence making sure things go this way, that they do not want to tone it down in Ukraine, despite obviously losing. Like, they would rather just take a horrible, horrible loss than even come to the negotiating table, it seems, because they spurned what I saw as a very, very generous offer from Putin to only take the oblasts in which were signed over into the constitution into Russia. But instead, they spurned that, and we're going to get total. I mean, it's just going to be over for the Ukrainian state. Who knows what the territory is going to look like, and it's going to be much bloodier if the Ukrainians don't regain some of their own sovereignty. We hear talks about this replacement regime. We were talking off air about Arestovich, some of these other wacky characters who might take Zelensky's place. I mean, who would want to, I guess, is one of the main questions. But we also remember last week we talked about Putin's trip to North Korea. We know that if things go bad and certain powers attack Russia proper, there might be North Korean troops on the ground with some of these new treaties that have been signed between the two countries. So very interesting developments indeed in Russia. Obviously, there's big things going on in the Middle East that we have to get to as well, but I'm sure you have some few updates from Ukraine as well.
Yeah, Ukraine has been really curious actually. On the ground, actually, the Azov battalion has reported that they're being worn out completely, like the Azov battalion, as well as what they call the triad. The triad, the Troika, is the 3rd Storm Brigade. It's like this new Azov, new right-wing Ukrainian brigade that they've developed. It has thousands of members at this point. It's probably even more popular than the Azov battalion right now, but they're being overused. The last time we saw the Troika utilized was actually this military infantry brigade was under Avdiivka, and a lot of them actually ended up perishing. But right after Avdiivka, the Ukrainian Central Military Command has shifted Troika north into Volchansk to fight the Russians fighting around Kharkov. So they've been given no rest, and now they're complaining. And so notice Zelensky leaves Ukraine for a little while, and you have these right-wing Ukrainian infantry stormtroopers who have a lot of battle experience. So mind you, their experience has really, they've been fighting for almost 2 years now. A lot of them are essentially veterans at this point, very skilled. You could say almost as good as the Wagner mercenary troops on the Russian side. And yeah, they are Ukrainian nationalists, but what will it take, Conrad, for them to actually turn against their, shall we say, the Dnipropetrovsk rabbinical masters, right? And that's the big question, because these people are essentially ethnic Russians who are, their brains, as we spoke to Andrei Afanasyev, they are brainwashed into thinking they are essentially Ukrainian nationalists and they need to fight for Odin and whatever have you. But at the end of the day, perhaps maybe they will wake up. But the big news from Ukraine, of course, this is a little bit crazy because Zelensky, there were, I think, 3 or 4 major posts by Ukrainian journalists on Facebook. And Facebook is very pro-Ukrainian, so they still use Facebook. And these Facebook posts were against the Ukrainian general Yuri Sodel, not Sobol, Sodel. And Sodel was essentially the second in charge of the entire Ukrainian military after Syrskyi. He was the commander of the joint forces of the armed forces of Ukraine, so essentially the ground forces. He was the main general in charge of the Avdiivka disaster and the pouring of Ukrainian troops there. He's very much disliked, but all it took was a few Facebook posts by Ukrainian journalists, and Zelensky read the posts and removed him from his position as a general. So we have the media in Ukraine literally influencing. And this is, even Arestovich said this was a bit ridiculous. Like he said, Solid is a pretty bad general, and Ukraine has some really awful generals right now in positions. But for Zelensky to literally be influenced by the media in order to tell which general is good and which is bad, I think is showing you the state of the Ukrainian war affairs. So Solid has been officially retired. And again, Ukraine is looking at what to do in Volchansk, which is pouring. Volchansk, the progression of the Russians has been halted somewhat because Ukraine is pouring a lot of these troops from the central Donetsk regions up north towards this city, which it really, really wants to hold. We're noticing the strategies are very much like hard-headed, very stubborn. We need to hold Bakhmut. We need to hold Avdiivka. Now we need to hold Volchansk, and Ukrainian lives will essentially be lost. But they are at the moment recruiting 100,000 to 200,000 fresh men, all the way up to past retirement age in Ukraine. So as you can see, all the drafting videos are increasing in volume. They are pulling people off the streets. And yeah, so they are looking for a fresh wave of recruits in this particular area. So some really interesting developments there. And naturally, the Zelensky's candidacy, his lack thereof, his lack of election, and the fact that he has been proclaimed legitimate at this recent peace treaty summit does point towards the fact that he will perhaps retain his presidentship for a little while longer. But we do have figures, as you said, like Arestovich, who has now been producing plenty of interviews online challenging Zelensky, stating that if there was a free election in Ukraine, he would run and he would probably beat him in an open election. Just FYI, Arestovich is not just a random pickup artist. Yes, he is a Andrew Tate type pickup artist in Ukraine, and his teacher was this Kabbalistic wizard, and he has psychology courses online which he makes money from. I'm not joking. Kabbalistic wizard. It's called Submersive Psychology, is the school of Kabbalistic astrology and psychology which he follows, and he releases courses on how to pick up women and relationship advice and Kabbalistic astrology, which he sells online to Ukrainian people. This is very bizarre. So on one hand, you have this actor, crossdresser, borderline homosexual Zelensky, potentially in a future election, running up against Arestovich, a former spy, theater actor, and someone who sells pickup courses online. I mean, it's just the entire country is in a ruinous state, right? And we know liberal democracies, and in and of themselves, this is quite normal for them. But yeah, this is a very extreme form of degeneracy we're seeing in Ukraine. So yeah, and unfortunately, in terms of other news from Ukraine, Conrad, Metropolitan Feodosy of Cherkasy has been placed under arrest, again, house arrest this time, for an undetermined state. So he's not allowed to attend the church anymore. He wasn't at church this Sunday. He had to serve like a house liturgy. So yeah, persecution's still happening, right? We have Metropolitan Jonathan released, but other metropolitans are being placed under house arrest. Potentially they'll be seeing more trials very soon. So again, the reign of the Antichrist continues in that part of the world.
Yeah, we're going to be praying, of course, for the persecution there. Everybody, of course, is seeing what's going on in Gaza and the Middle East, but can't forget that the persecution in Ukraine is going on steadily. But moving on to the situation in the Middle East, in the Holy Land specifically, again, we've got a big episode about Lebanon, the West Bank, Gaza coming out this week with Isaac Swalem. But what's going on there, of course, is the dial just keeps getting heated up, even past 10, it feels, at this point. Everybody is talking about the war in Lebanon. Every country is asking their citizens to pull out. Saudi Arabia, the United States, France, everybody is saying, leave Lebanon if your citizens are there. Things are about to happen. Everybody seems to be aware that Israel is planning on expanding the operation into the north of Lebanon. We are getting reports out of Gaza that the Israelis are losing a lot of armor, that Hamas is not, defeated. We're getting all these things about Hamas will take 10 plus years to fully defeat Hamas. There's rumors that they were going to leave Qatar, but the leadership is staying put. It seems that the Qatari authorities are allowing them to stay, not giving them grief. And the situation overall is just escalating to the point where, we see the USS Wasp, which is an amphibious assault landing vehicle, now arriving in the eastern Mediterranean. We see aircraft carriers that were in the Red Sea, again, redirected up into the Mediterranean, as the Houthis, of course, continue to be victorious. We'll get into that in a second. But in general, it seems the inevitable is going to happen. Israel is going to expand the war into Lebanon. And then inevitably, it's already said that the United Resistance in Iraq and Syria will basically fight as one front with Hezbollah against the IDF. I'm sure they will bring these into the Golan Heights if they can. They will try to perhaps push back into southern Israel. I don't know if anything's going to happen in the West Bank. We obviously have the rumors of the total annexation, effectively, of East Jerusalem being put under total Israeli law, and Smotrich, again, getting even more empowered across the entirety of the West Bank than he already is in Zone C. You can listen to the Ether Hour this week to learn more about the reality of all of that. But yeah, I mean, it seems that Lebanon war is inevitable. I know we predicted it last week. It seems that the next few weeks are really going to tell the tale, because I think they're going to want to kind of get all of this done while the election is heating up, while perhaps Biden's candidacy and presidency are up in the air. And then they can kind of do some of the dirty work while everybody's distracted with that, to then when Trump gets in, which seems like he is, he will just sign over and approve basically everything that they did, try to get everything peaceful, but give the Israelis the territory that they gained, whatever it is that ends up happening. So it seems that the Zionists are playing for keeps and they're not going to back down. Ben-Gvir is saying that if there's some kind of peace agreement in any of these places and the war isn't expanded into Lebanon, he's leaving the coalition government with Netanyahu. And Netanyahu's in a very precarious position, so he needs those hardliners to stay with him in a governmental capacity to protect him from, the Supreme Court and the Israeli public and the opposition who want to prosecute him and throw him out of power and all of these sorts of things. So it's all really coming to a fore here, and I don't know how involved Iran is going to be once Israel enters Lebanon. Obviously, their proxies are going to be, Hezbollah is going to be the main combatant, which is going to be some bloody fighting. If you think the Hamas tunnel networks are deep, the Hezbollah tunnels are much, much deeper.
Yeah, Hezbollah has been preparing for 18 years for this invasion, and the time has finally come. So all their preparation was not for nothing, and I think they're ready to face Israel. They've also been watching since October 7th the strategies that Hamas has employed against Israeli tanks, things like that. So they've been learning. We saw all the drone footage. I think our special A for our episode actually covers that quite in depth. Really worth listening to us discuss that with Isaac, which will be dropping very, very soon. But yes, yeah, Yoav Gallant, naturally, the guy whom the ICC has placed an arrest warrant for, has stated very openly, Israel could return Lebanon to the Stone Age. We do not want a war with Hezbollah. However, we do accept the presence of Hezbollah military formations on our borders as a threat. And these claims that they're potentially vowing for peace, but Hezbollah is forcing their hand, I think is falling on deaf ears. We are noticing the Israeli bombardment is intensifying over southern Lebanon. We saw that some of the footage, the incendiary bombs. I mean, they look very apocalyptic as they sort of rain at night over the landscape of southern Lebanon. There, some great fires are raging on in that area at the moment. We spoke about that last week. A lot of them are not being put out on time, and a lot of infrastructure is being destroyed on the Lebanese end. Nobody's being held accountable. Israel is doing whatever it pleases. And going forward, like this Lebanese conflict, Conrad, when the invasion on land does take place, and we do see hundreds of Israeli tanks actually being pushed north. We see the highways are full, essentially, of military shipments being drawn to that northern border between Lebanon and Israel. I think it'll most likely be a quick. Well, they hope it'll be quick, but it'll be a purge operation of essentially the southern quarter of Lebanon. I don't think they'll push up as north as far as Beirut or anything of that sort. They're going to keep it isolated and create this weird, almost like a buffer zone that we hear a lot about in this sanitary zone type discussions, which President Putin and Zelensky have been throwing around recently. How there is a need to create this sanitary buffer zone between the two states. That's exactly what I think Israel will be pushing for here in this zone. But the sanitary zone itself will be over the corpses of all these Hamas militants, which it claims it wants to clear from this area. So I think Israel at this point is definitely down to have a war before the election, before November strikes. And in the next few weeks, most mainstream media sources are claiming that, yes, and the embassies, right? This is what we keep an eye out on, not just the mainstream media, what they say, but also the embassies. The Saudi embassy in Lebanon has called for all Saudi citizens to leave the country. Russia has asked for nobody to visit Beirut anymore from Russian citizens. I mean, the Russians had enough stress trying to get their citizens and hostages out of sort of dangerous situations between Hamas and Israel. They don't want to be tied down in this particular conflict either, because again, Russia's really much in no man's land here in terms of it does have the bizarre Israeli oligarchs it needs to appease, and also some of its Muslim allies in this particular area of the world. So when the conflict does end up escalating, Conrad, I think the big question will be how deeply will the U.S. Navy be involved here? The American Navy, which is already fighting the Houthis basically openly in the Red Sea in the south. We do have these aircraft carriers, the USS Eisenhower, moving from the Red Sea back into the Eastern Mediterranean. They're all positioning themselves for this war between Hezbollah and Israel. And will American planes, will American pilots, will they take part in this? That's the other question. Because if they do, there is a threat to American lives. And again, Americans have there's no use for Americans to actually be here and putting their lives at risk in a conflict which frankly shouldn't involve them at all, between Muslims and essentially Zionist Jews. So I think that's one thing which either Trump or Biden could potentially win out on, calling for peace between these two countries, or essentially Hezbollah and Israel. But we both know that won't be the talking point here. It'll be complete Zionist gish gallop that'll be thrown at us.
Yeah, before we leave the Holy Land situation, the Houthis are making big progress. They just used their new unmanned nautical vehicles to totally destroy big shipping, this big ship called Trans World One or something. So big anti-trans victory for Ansar Allah and the Yemeni Houthis. But we talked last week about the increase in Somali piracy because of how many ships have had to redirect away from the Red Sea and the Suez Canal and go around the Horn of Africa, thus passing by the Somali and Kenyan shores where there is a major piracy problem. And the Houthis have been so victorious that there are rumors that Russia is even talking to Iran about arming the Houthis in some capacity. I don't know the veracity of those rumors or what exactly the benefit would be, but it does seem that the Houthis are holding their own. I think in the long run, the Russians and the Chinese will probably end up recognizing and supporting them as the true and final government in Yemen, which it seems that they have earned as they were able to operate very powerful military operations just in this densely populated Red Sea area against U.S. aircraft carriers, drones, UK and US coordinated airstrikes. So it's quite the impressive feat, to say the least. But going down to Somalia, as we said, just south of the Red Sea, we have a big update in the Turkish front with Turkey negotiating between Somalia and Ethiopia. We know that Ethiopia had made that deal a while back with Somaliland, that breakaway northern province of Somalia, to have a port on the Red Sea, basically, and finally gain access to their 100 plus million population to the ocean, allow them to have international trade undisturbed. And Turkey is stepping in. Obviously, the Turks are pro-Mogadishu. They are allied with the central government down in Somalia, and they are saying that Ethiopia, don't do this. We'll just give you a port. Somalia will. And obviously, Turkey has much more negotiating power than Somalia in almost any situation. So I don't know how much choice Somalia really has in that matter. But the Ethiopians, who knows what they're going to say? I don't know how tied they are to the Somaliland project. If it seems that they are unlikely to maintain power. They don't want to have a deal with somebody that's going to get kicked out of power. So then the Somalians can be like, screw you, no port at all. So I think they might end up going with this Turkish proposed deal. But in the Turkosphere more broadly, what's even more relevant these days, and this is a breaking story as we're recording, the Turks seem to be pulling out of Syria. And there's this big story in Eastern Syria, some town, I'm forgetting the name, where basically a Syrian refugee, I guess, raped a 14-year-old girl or something like that. So now the Turks are rallying against Syrians, rallying against Erdogan, who they blame for bringing all the Syrians into Turkey. They're saying about how they're proud to be Turks, very pro-Turkish nationalist stuff, very anti-Islamist. They all are Muslims, I'm sure, that are protesting, but it's this, we discussed this with David Erhan in our Turkish political analysis videos about how the quote-unquote more liberal secularist people are very much against the mass immigration from the Muslim world. They view it as making Turkey more Islamist and less secular Kemalist. So that's what's going on, and that seems to have something to do with this Turkish withdrawal. We see the Free Syrian Army, the anti-Assad factions, are kind of now attacking some of these Turkish bases and everything. And this comes right after Erdogan talked about completely recognizing and reopening diplomatic relations with Syria and Assad. And I mean, this is literally breaking as I'm recording this. F-16s appear to be scrambled in Turkey and are going to be operating against some of these FSA, Syrian rebel groups that were in the region that Turkey was operating in Syria. I don't know if this affects what they're doing in Iraq. I haven't heard any similar news, but it appears that perhaps there was a deal struck and perhaps the Turks are pulling out of Syria. They're going to do some cleanup work on the Free Syrian Army and these other things, and then ultimately pull out and recognize Assad and support him.
I mean, it's huge news. I think the re-establishment of diplomatic relations between Turkey and Syria will be one of those first huge steps. And when if Turkey does essentially leave northern Syria completely, which is the sovereign territory of Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian people, this will of course free up Syria and free up the pressure for it to focus on the southern enemy, which has been bombing Syrian airports for like literally almost a decade at this point, which is Israel, right? And perhaps this is Erdogan's small strategy. Like Erdogan, he has allowed the Turkish military to train themselves up for something. Perhaps that prophetic war, which the saints speak about, Conrad, between Turkey and Greece. In a way, you could say that the Turkish military and the Turkish Air Force was practicing and warming up in Syria, fighting against these weird Kurdish rebels, these questionable members of ISIS, these Islamic extremists, and these sort of elements in Syria, using Syria, which is quite rude, frankly, using another country's territory as a training playground, essentially, for its troops. But now that the training exercise is over, perhaps Turkey can now relinquish control back to the Syrian army and relieve that stress so that perhaps Assad could assist Hezbollah and maybe even strike towards the Golan Heights. Who knows? Maybe this is Erdogan's way of saying, giving a middle finger to the Zionist masters, which still hold a lot of influence in Turkey. Unfortunately, we do know Jewish money, not only has influence over Cyprus and a lot of Turkish business, a lot of Turkish businessmen still have a lot of lucrative deals with a lot of these. It's a similar situation to Russia, right? What can we say? Especially the Azeri lobby. Look at the Azeri businessmen. Azeri businessmen have very interesting ties to mountain Jewish communities, things like that. Zionists, we discuss these sort of things quite often. So Turkey is not very sovereign if you talk about its capitalistic ends, especially with this recent issue of inflation, which it still hasn't resolved, right? So I think generally speaking, Turkey pulling out of Syria, it's a quid pro quo, benefits both countries, right? Both countries have something to gain here, and perhaps they're freeing Assad up for so that he could assist Hezbollah in the coming conflict. Yeah, so I think diplomatic relations, Conrad, it's really important for Turkey to uphold them with Syria, because we must remember that even there are natural language barriers between these two countries too, because in Syria the majority of people speak Arabic, and in Turkey, of course, they speak Turkish. So for the average person, if diplomatic relations are broken for more than a decade, you can imagine the kind of rift it causes between the two countries. And at one point, they were united naturally under two former empires, the Byzantine Roman Empire, and then, of course, under the Ottoman Empire. So these two, you can say, land masses, these two countries have had a common fate, a common destiny throughout history. And I think moving forward, hopefully they need to collaborate in order to cause more prosperity in that particular Middle Eastern region, which has been dominated by pro-Israeli policies, you can say, ever since the fall of the Second World War.
Turkey also are facilitating some big moves in the Caucasus, of course. Armenia is on the verge of just signing a peace agreement with Azerbaijan, recognizing their sovereignty over all of their new claimed areas, those villages, Nagorno-Karabakh. And Armenia is also going to open up diplomatic relations again with Turkey, which I don't know the exact history, but I think that's going to be pretty big, of course. I think that even involves, Armenian genocide, and those things had been preventing that from happening because Turkey, of course, doesn't recognize it and perpetuates what the Armenians perceive as genocide denial. And they, of course, they perceive them as kind of oppressing them from their western border in that capacity, with the Azeris getting them from the east. And comes while Armenian pro-Pashinyan authorities basically accuse Russia of going in with their peacekeeping forces and personally handing Nagorno-Karabakh over to the Azerbaijanis, which is pretty hilarious considering that they're the ones that initially started breaking up the CSTO and all these other things. So it says a lot that the Pashinyan bloc are leaning so heavily into this pro-Western alliance, signing away everything to Turkey and Azerbaijan, and then they're like, but those Russians did everything. So, quite the interesting rhetoric from them. I don't know how Pashinyan, as I've said a million times, is still in power in Armenia. I don't know if the former bishop Bagrat Bakanyan, I'm forgetting his exact name, is going to be able to unseat him, but it would probably be good for the Armenian people if he does. But some other news that we have to discuss, of course, is there was that fake coup in Bolivia. It kind of seemed fake from the beginning because it was like, how are these armored vehicles getting to the presidential palace so quick? And then the head of the military, Zuniga, the general, was immediately arrested, and now I don't even know if he's going to spend any time in prison after being arrested. He's talking to the press, immediately saying, yeah, Acre, the president, he set me up for this, and I guess the whole thing was basically the current leader doing this coup to boost his image against Evo Morales, who's like the historic, socialist leader of Bolivia. And it seems that the whole thing was fake, and that kind of came out within an hour of it all happening. But it was quite an interesting coup, with the troops immediately rolling up. It was much more visible than some of these African coups that happen sort of in slow motion, it seems. But yeah, that was a fake coup. All of the socialist countries, Maduro, Lula, they all were condemning it, of course. I don't know exactly how they understood the operation to be going on or not, but the person who Acre, the current leader, claimed was behind the coup immediately denounced the coup from prison. So it kind of was clearly an op. But that's not the biggest news. What's also going on, of course, is we see some unfortunate developments in Serbia. They say that they're no longer against their ammunition from other that they give to certain countries then being sent to Ukraine, which they're not personally sending things to Ukraine, but they're basically conceding that it's going to happen and kind of supporting it. There was a recent summit between Vucic and Kurti, and there's rumors that Serbia is going to make all sorts of anti-Russian moves, which is unfortunate. I don't know exactly the truth to that. I don't know how someone like Dodik, for example, could support that, as he has visited Russia 5+ times since the special military operation started, and they have supported him and what he's doing in Srpska against the Bosniak authorities. But I don't know exactly if you have any thoughts on the Serbia question, but besides that, we only have a few other stories to discuss here.
Yeah, I think primarily what we're seeing here is that the West is banking on its whatever strings and attachments it has to Vucic and pulling on them, forcing him to perhaps align more with the whole pro-Western Kosovo issue as well as anti-Russian policies that have been perpetrated. We see Greece, Romania very much siding against Russia in this Eastern Bloc country. Perhaps they want to pull Serbia into that relationship as well, and probably isolate Dodik a little bit in Bosnia Herzegovina, because if Dodik sees Vucic doing really unsavory things in relation to, being pro-Russian, perhaps he will feel less like he would need to, cause revolt in Bosnia Herzegovina, and the life of that particular failed state will be prolonged, right? And we do see Vucic really recently giving, again, these vague statements. We may return to calling him the cuck of Kosovo once again, Conrad, because I think he definitely deserves it. But listen to this quote from him. He says, "We live in a world where there is no security, stability, and it is impossible to know what will happen before the end of this year, much less plan for the future. Therefore, we must think about our country and prepare well for every possible scenario to understand what is happening in this world in Europe and where Serbia lies in all of this." Well, that's a quote, Alexander Vucic. Well, if we're not sure of what to do in the future, perhaps we shouldn't be aligning with the United States unquestionably. Like, what is he receiving? We're still not sure. Will the US give the Serbian people more liberties? Will they return Kosovo monasteries back to him? Like, what? We still don't know what exactly Vucic is getting back from this betrayal, right, of, say, the Serbian people and their foreign political interests, Conrad. And I'm not sure if we ever will find out. So this is really unfortunate news. But Vucic has pivoted before, right? He's a real snake, if we can call, like, if the Balkans even have snakes. I know Mount Athos has domestic snakes, but I'm not sure if a Balkan has any sort of. But Vucic is definitely one of them, and I think it's very. We can openly claim this now that he has betrayed the Serbian people once again. But perhaps he could come back just as he has in the past. Very dangerous sort of character, and very much leads me to believe perhaps Dodik is that future figure that the Serbian people really need to lean on in terms of pushing them towards greater independence in southeastern Europe. But the last story, of course, is that really confusing situation taking place in Greece, right? We have the Prime Minister Mitsotakis betraying the Greek people, of course, pushing gay marriage this year, which was one of probably the biggest L's in 2024. And now suddenly he's come out openly against Archbishop Elpidophorus, criticizing him for his pro-Turkish stances. And it's very bizarre because we have the Prime Minister of Greece, who is pro-LGBTQ, pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, pro-Zelensky, suddenly arguing very openly in the media, going to the media, actually using it against one of the most powerful archbishops of the ecumenical patriarchate, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop of America, Archbishop Elpidophorus, who is also very much borderline heretical, and he does make very liberal statements. So, Conrad, just wonder what your thoughts are in this weird fight between, say, Trotsky and Stalin that we're seeing in this new sort of Greek Orthodox world.
Well, I guess the good news is that it'll likely lead to Archbishop Elpidophoros no longer being the head of GoArch in America. I don't know how good the replacement will be, but it will also prevent him from likely ever rising to the rank of ecumenical patriarch, which I think is what Mitsotakis is really going for here. He is afraid of Elpidophoros becoming the EP and him perceiving the EP as being way too Turkish influenced or somehow compromised to Turkish or Turkish operations even within the US. I think there's some connection with the whole Bob Menendez Turkish intelligence scandal thing. So I think Mitsotaki's doing this is not for because he's based and wants to protect orthodoxy in America or orthodoxy in the Fana or anything like that, but I think God is using political circumstances to again fulfill the prophecy of St. Porphyrios and perhaps have a better crew to man the ship. I mean, I don't know exactly who is likely to replace him in GoArch, which is very relevant to me, of course. I frequent GoArch monasteries and have a lot of friends in GoArch, so it'll be quite interesting. But if anybody is interested in the potential replacements for Elpidophoros as head of GoArch, Archbishop of America, let us know in the comments and maybe we'll do a review or some content about all of the likely candidates. But yeah, that's pretty much everything. I know this was a packed show. We were kind of all over the place. But yeah, let us know in the comments what you think is going on in World War III with the Trump-Biden stuff, with the Israel-Lebanon stuff. When do you think they're going to go in? Be sure to keep your eyes peeled for the upcoming Ether Hour episode with Isaac. It's really big. Be sure to check out the episode with Rachel. That was a really good episode on feminism and its occult roots. Rachel Wilson. That'll probably be linked below as well. So again, thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check us out on Substack, worldwarnow.co. That's worldwarnow.substack.com. Both links work. That's how you can get behind the paywall and get access to every Ether Hour episode. You can follow us on Twitter at worldwarnow_. You can find me on Twitter at GnomeRad. You can follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Leave a comment. Everything over there is very good. We're going to start doing more live streams, hopefully. So subscribe over there. If you're subscribed on one, be sure to subscribe on the other. It's kind of our two-pronged spear of content distribution. But be sure to follow us on Rumble as well. That's a backup. I'm going to try to get more stuff going on there as well. But be sure to follow the Telegram. That's probably one of the most important places to follow, World War Now Telly. We've surpassed 3,000 followers on there, so that's amazing. That's probably your best live news feed you're going to find anywhere, so be sure to follow there. And with all of that, thank you again so much for listening and making it to the end of the show. Dimitri, I'll let you send the people off.
Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Conrad, for this great discussion. So many amazing news, both tragic and triumphant for us. And of course, I think the main event is the election of the Patriarch of Bulgaria. We hope Patriarch Daniel leads the Bulgarian Orthodox people forward and into eventual, I think, not just spiritual freedom, but also civic freedom in and of this world, because the Bulgarian people do need independence and sovereignty. And naturally, the triumphant event, of course, on the feast day of Pentecost, the Orthodox Church received two new martyrs, Saint Michael and Saint Nicholas, both the guard and the priest in the cities of Derbent and Mahachkala. So the people of Dagestan have two Orthodox Christians to now venerate as their own martyrs, and we, of course, have a higher martyr and essentially a new martyr to venerate as well. So we hope these saints pray for us in this coming tumultuous world that we live in. And some of the events coming up, I think, will definitely require a lot of prayer, I think, from the saints. So let's make sure we keep asking them for help. Thank you guys for listening.
God bless everybody.